Welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together in community into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 35. Everybody wants to rule the world. This season 3, we're taking a look at the 5 key elements of formation. These 5 characteristics that describe every type of community designed to form us to become like someone else, whether it be a marriage, early childhood, the military, educational institutions, AA, and even exercise programs. A friend of mine recently suggested that CrossFit is a powerful example of a purposeful, formative community. And he's right. These types of formative cultures exist in varying degrees for both kingdoms, the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. I've suggested that the Playboy Mansion is one of the best modern examples of a formative community. Hugh Hefner invited women of a certain type, what he described as the girl next door, into his community, and he formed them into exploited sex slaves. The Playboy Mansion system deeply embodies these 5 key elements: time, habits, community, intimacy, and instruction. Hefner created a highly effective, deeply impactful, immersive culture of formation, a dark greenhouse, if you will. Well, today we're finishing up our overview of the second element of formation, habits. There isn't some grand list of habits or spiritual disciplines to be discovered and mastered. Most Christians are acquainted with well-known habits such as prayer and fasting and corporate worship, service, and Bible reading, and those are all fantastic. Though our teacher, in his wisdom, seems to enjoy introducing us to all sorts of ways of becoming more like him, and his creativity has no limits. Because God has placed us into 4 relationships, we've been looking at habits through that lens. And really, we've just looked at one habit, the habit of listening. Listening to God's voice, listening to the hearts of others, and listening to our own hearts. Well, that leaves us with one relationship left to explore, and that's our relationship to creation and culture. How does a deep disciple, someone being spiritually formed in an intentional community like a greenhouse, practice the habit of listening to nature and culture? Sounds a bit weird. Well, let's go to the Great Commission. And Jesus came up and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Make disciples, baptize them or immerse them, hint, hint, into the reality of the triune God, and teach them to observe everything that God commanded. Well, everything that God commanded means a whole lot of words in a pretty long book. So, what's the very first thing God taught us to do? What's the very first thing God said to any human being in the Bible? We find it in Genesis 1:28. He's just finished creating Adam and Eve, and the very first thing God tells them is their purpose, their why. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth." This first statement that God gave to mankind actually has a name. It's called the cultural commission. Commission means mission with. God tells Adam and Eve their purpose is to multiply, subdue, and rule. Have babies, make families, communities, cities, nations. Subdue means to bring order to, form, organize, and rule the earth with God. Our mission, our co-mission, is to populate, structure, and rule the earth for human flourishing and goodness with God. It's a wonderful, beautiful, adventurous co-mission with the very Creator. Now, just note how the Great Commission in Matthew ends. The very last thing Jesus says before he ascends into heaven is this: "I am with you until the end of the age." That's what makes the second commission a co-mission. We make disciples with Jesus. You get the sense that God really, really wants to be with us. Jesus' Great Commission embodies everything that God has taught us, and the very first thing God taught us to do is to populate the earth, subdue it, and rule it with Him. The second commission embodies and envelops the first commission. The Great Commission embodies and assumes the cultural commission. Now, I'm not sure how many modern Christians believe that our primary role is to rule the earth with God, to mold creation and culture for the goodness of mankind and human flourishing. In many cases, many Christians assume the point is to actually escape God's good earth instead of joining with Him in its restoration. There's a popular YouTube channel called The Bible Project. It's a series of creative videos that provide high-level overviews of the various books and themes and stories of the Bible. The two creators of the channel, Dr. Tim Mackey and John Collins, also have a podcast that's related to it, and they made a really interesting point there on this cultural commission from Genesis 1. In terms of God's instructions for humans to multiply, subdue, and rule the earth, this is precisely what we've done for millennia. We have babies. We form all sorts of families and neighborhoods, communities, societies, cities, businesses, nations. We form groups around hobbies and interests, around beliefs and passions. And we do subdue. We tame nature. We invent. We innovate. The car is an example of how humans subdue. It's an invention that allows us greater freedom now than any other time in human history. We have medicines and hospitals, communications technology, advances in architecture and engineering. Humans are constantly taming, forming, inventing, discovering. It's who we are. It's how God made us. And we do rule. We steward. We form. We organize. We create structure. We create beauty in art and music. We discover in science, philosophy, sociology. We create cities and governments, businesses, nonprofits. We form ways of stewarding ourselves and the natural order. So the question isn't really if humans should multiply, subdue, and rule the earth. The question is, do we multiply, subdue, and rule as a co-mission or as a solo mission? Are we multiplying, subduing, and ruling as co-regents with our king, or are we doing those things for ourselves? Are we ruling on behalf of the kingdom of light or the kingdom of darkness? Welcome back to the Garden of Eden. And there's the obvious problem. When humans multiply and subdue and rule for ourselves, we are spectacularly successful at screwing up, harming, killing, destroying, and annihilating the very communities and structures we've just formed. It's true for individuals, marriages, families, communities, and nations, from a woman addicted to painkillers to a country always involved in some sort of territorial war. Here's one way to summarize the Old Testament: God desiring to be with man, and man continually pushing God away and attempting to take control themselves. In one of the more heartbreaking scenes of the Old Testament, the Israelites demand that God be removed from his position as their king because they want a human king. Samuel talks to God on their behalf, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Now, Israel's human kings ended up, for the most part, being disasters, and the nation split in two and fell apart. But God would not be denied being with us, so he became a human king himself. And this king announced a new kingdom. It's a new reality. His kingdom took off like a shot and has been growing ever since, though mankind still has a pesky habit of rejecting the co in the word commission. But this side of the ascension, things are really quite radically different. For example, God's presence is once again dwelling on earth this side of the cross. Only this time, he's actually closer to us than when he walked with Adam and Eve. After the entrance of sin in Genesis 3, God kept coming back to dwell with his people in the tabernacle and then the temple. Then Jesus came and announced that he was God's dwelling place on earth, the temple. And then when he left, he sent the Spirit, and now we are God's dwelling place on earth. That's exactly how Paul describes us. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? We are God's temple, an ever-growing, ever-loving human community of temples all over the world. That's why Dallas Willard says the primary function of the church isn't evangelism or doctrine or apologetics, as important as those things are. The primary purpose of the church is to be the dwelling place of God on earth. Heaven and earth rejoined. God with us, through us. We sit at the feet of our teacher, becoming more like him, and we partner with him to increase his kingdom here on earth, to assist him as he increases the size and the influence of his temple, as it were. If that phrasing sounds familiar to you, well, it probably is. When his disciples asked Jesus how to talk to the Father, he answered with the very famous Lord's Prayer. Well, what's the first request that Jesus instructs us to ask our Father for? That his kingdom would come to earth here as it is in heaven, God's place. That heaven and earth would be rejoined, just like it was back in Eden. So, if each of us are little temples where God dwells, what should be our habit as it relates to our fourth relationship, creation and culture? A disciple develops the habit of listening and looking for ways to multiply, subdue, and rule the earth on behalf of our King. So, let's just break those three words down a little bit. What does it mean to multiply? Well, in one sense, that's pretty obvious. We have kids. Children formed in a Christian home are invited to be kingdom builders at a very young age. Most major religions naturally understand and promote that the future of their religion is extremely dependent on having lots of children. Now, modern technology has put more emphasis on the parents determining the number of children they have and when they have them, but the point still stands. Any reasonably intelligent people group knows that increasing the population of their group is the primary way by which that group survives and thrives. And in the Great Commission, Jesus carries on this fill the earth command of the cultural commission and applies it to our spiritual birth. Let's go make more and more people who follow Jesus. Multiply, multiply, multiply. The more people on the earth who follow Jesus, the more those people have babies who grow up to follow Jesus, the more of God's temples we have on the earth. And the more the kingdom grows, right here on the earth. But the kingdom isn't only the church. It's the entire cosmos, and the church is the primary change agent by which the kingdom comes. So not only do we multiply, but we also subdue and rule. We steward, we manage. So how does a modern-day disciple subdue and rule the earth on behalf of our King instead of on behalf of ourselves? We seek to care for the created order for the benefit of mankind, and we seek to influence all aspects of culture for the kingdom, all 7 mountains. We intend to impact creation and culture for the kingdom. Did Jesus do that? Did he impact all 7 mountains of culture? Family, education, business, the arts, media, the church, and the government? Well, let's look briefly at each mountain. Family. Did Jesus teach and model how to love well in the family? Sure, including some great direction on marriage, raising kids, coexisting with other families. And he modeled extraordinary familial intimacy with his father and with his friends. How about education? Did Jesus teach and model how to educate? Jesus is the most intelligent, wisest teacher ever to walk the planet. He used nature illustrations, stories, proverbs, real-life examples, parables, humor, grammar, debate tactics, play on words, and other techniques to educate the people around him. And he clearly demonstrated that a primary mission of education is not just to inform, but to form the human heart. Let's look at business. Did Jesus teach and model how to deal with other people in business? He was a carpenter, so presumably he created a product and sold it to the public. And he gave clear instructions on how disciples in his kingdom are to treat other people economically. He encouraged integrity, service, fiscal responsibility, and how we engage others. And he used various business illustrations in his teachings. And how about media? Did Jesus model how a disciple should use media to increase the kingdom? I find Jesus to be a media wizard. He knew how to get his message out and influence people. That's the primary purpose of media. He used the tools of his day to birth a movement that has been spreading worldwide ever since. So that makes Jesus the wisest media executive ever to grace the planet. He understood his core purpose, his core audience. He was able to cut through the religion and the governmental clutter. He spoke to mass audiences, and he taught in small groups. He went to local hot spots like the synagogue, and he taught in fields. He used certain stories, certain phrases, certain miracles to make his points, knowing those things would spread through the communities because he is a master marketer. How about arts and entertainment? Did Jesus show us how to increase his kingdom through piquing our interests and our imagination? If a wonderful purpose of arts and entertainment is to tell stories, make music, create visual arts, and to provoke the deeper things of life in us, did Jesus model that? If the arts are for reminding us of what is good, beautiful, and truthful, did Jesus do that? Well, again, he was a carpenter, and most people who work with wood have to have some artistic skills. Jesus often re-engaged Old Testament stories to capture his audience's imagination. He brought up psalms and songs. He painted word pictures. He told parables to make points. He used props to further draw his audience into his message. He occasionally and purposefully surprised or shocked his audience for greater appeal. Seems like he had a deep grasp on how to provoke the deeper things of the heart through art and entertaining devices. How about the church? Did Jesus teach and model how to increase the kingdom through communities of believers? It's hard to argue this one, since it seems he had a great passion for breaking down the harsh, unloving religious institutions of his day. His strongest criticism was for church leaders. He had no problem calling them out in private or public for misleading people into legalism and conformity rather than love and freedom. And as we pointed out last episode, he modeled a method of Christian community that seemed bizarre and backwards to many religious leaders. The original Christian immersive community of formation, or greenhouse, a bunch of no-name men and women who lived with their master for a few years and then went on to change the world. The modern church has lost some of its zeal and passion to increase the kingdom in some of these mountains. We're comfortable with some, but very uncomfortable with others. We're pretty good with Christian schools for education or maybe homeschooling. And there are some great groups around the country that help Christians run their businesses according to biblical principles. Although I've not seen any strategies for the kingdom to influence Fortune 500 companies or Wall Street, but perhaps they're out there and I just don't know about them. Someone should work on that, as Amazon, Google, and Facebook are all part of God's kingdom. Regarding the arts, the church has pretty much given up on some of that. Most churches have little vision for the kingdom as it relates to things like fashion or sculpting or good theater or art shows. How about the cultural mountain of government? Some of us unconsciously accept the idea that Jesus was non-political, that his ministry here had nothing to do with politics, and so Christians should have nothing to do with politics inside or outside of our churches. Well, that's a bizarre conclusion, especially if you read the Gospels at face value. N.T. Wright wrote, quote, "It is time, and long past time, to reread the Gospels as what we can only call political theology. Not because they are not, after all, about God and spirituality and new birth and holiness and all the rest, but precisely because they are," end quote. The New Testament makes it abundantly clear that Jesus is now the head over all rule and authority, all powers, all principalities, all governments, and all social structures. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He wore a crown and a robe at his crucifixion. Pilate put a sign on the top of the cross that read King of the Jews. Jesus wasn't political? John the Baptist announced his new kingdom. That's a political term. We can't properly read the Sermon on the Mount without watching Jesus paint a picture of how life in the kingdom is to be lived and just how radically different and challenging that was from the accepted political and social ideas and practices of the day. The kingdom of God is most certainly a political reality, and its king is most certainly a political figure. For some reason, we sing it, and we say it, and proclaim it, and pray it, and then we sit back and wring our hands when our pastor dares to make a comment about the federal government's position on something. And so there's this tension. We desperately want Jesus to be the King of Kings, but we somehow find him incompatible with our current governmental systems. Well, what about that "render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's" quote? Isn't that the biblical proof text for keeping church and state entirely separate entities? In fact, doesn't that phrase make it sound like Caesar has his stuff and God has his stuff? N.T. Wright wrote, quote, "I think it's safe to say that nobody until the late 18th century ever took it like that. In other words, we are hearing in that interpretation the echo of a very different set of voices, those of the European and American Enlightenment and the theory of church and state that they developed," end quote. During his verbal exchange, Jesus cunningly asked his accusers whose image and inscription is on the coin, and instructs us to give to Caesar what's his and to God what's his. Well, what belongs to God? And why does Jesus ask the question about whose image is on the coin when he knows full well each of us is made in God's image? Wright goes on to conclude, quote, "Perhaps it's time for God, whose image is on every human being and whose inscription is written across the pages of creation and the story of Israel, to receive his due." End quote. Was Jesus promoting the modern concept that our churches aren't allowed to comment on or be involved in government, or was he signaling that the time had come for the entire world to recognize that it all belongs to God, including government? Deep disciple practices the habit of listening and looking for opportunities to heal, redeem, and restore in the created order, in nature, and all 7 mountains of culture, because it all belongs to Jesus, the King. Okay, so what does this look like in modern life? How does a deep disciple in a greenhouse heal, redeem, and restore in creation and culture? Well, the first question is, are we listening for those opportunities? Do we intend to look for ways to grow the kingdom through culture? Do we get up every morning intending on stewarding God's good creation on his behalf? Because every day we're working on somebody's kingdom. This doesn't mean we're all leaving our careers and heading for full-time ministry or doing missions work in Africa or running for Congress, although a few of you really should run for Congress. I've worked in ministry at times during my career, and inevitably someone would walk up to me after I get done speaking at some event and express how fortunate I was to be in, quote, full-time Christian work. Well, typically I would ask that person what they did. Maybe they were a teacher, or an engineer, or an accountant, or a stay-at-home mom, or a barista. Then I'd ask them this question: why is what I do more important or more holy than what you do? A teacher forms the minds of young people, bringing structure and organization and helping them think and relate. Now, that's the kingdom. An engineer protects humankind from harm by safely designing everything from electrical circuits to bridges, from software to furniture. They bring order from chaos, safety from danger. That's the kingdom. An accountant forms information into bite-sized chunks so the rest of us can understand. They bring organization from disorganization. They provide clarity in the midst of confusion. That's the kingdom. I thank God some people actually like accounting. A stay-at-home mom is arguably the most formative person in the life of her children. The day in, day out, mundane tasks of motherhood may seem unimportant, and in our day even derided in some places, but is there a higher calling than forming the heart of a little image bearer of God? That's the kingdom. How about the barista? They take disorganized, sometimes disparate ingredients and combine them into something pleasurable and helpful to fellow humans. Kingdom. It's the same for someone who bakes or cooks. They organize what was disorganized, combine things that are sometimes otherwise distasteful, and create a culinary work of art from odd-looking ingredients, most of which come out of the dirty ground. Is that not the definition of stewardship? Except cilantro. Cilantro is irredeemable. It's the spawn of Satan. Remember, we're all fulfilling a cultural mission right now. The question isn't whether we're multiplying, subduing, and ruling in a kingdom. We are. The question is, whose kingdom are we building? So in our day-to-day routine, whatever it is, are we consciously intending, desiring to grow Jesus' kingdom through healing, redeeming, and restoring, multiplying, subduing, and ruling? Are we listening and looking for opportunities to create beauty, promote goodness, proclaim truth where we are? To honor our King, to serve others, to promote human flourishing, to confront injustice, to conquer evil. In other words, to do the types of things that Jesus did. Well, obviously there is much more to explore on habits that can never fit into this podcast, but hopefully these last few episodes have whetted your appetite for learning and practicing some new spiritual disciplines. Perhaps you or your greenhouse are thinking about trying some new ones. You may venture into confession or fasting, or you may practice listening to other people's hearts. The point is to specify the habits you wish to try, seek the counsel of the Holy Spirit, and approach them as a group with humility and lots of grace. Remember, the journey to become more like Jesus takes time, takes a lifetime. And as you test and experiment with various habits, your greenhouse will discover what's helpful and what you may want to put aside for a while. Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, share the podcast, and don't forget, most of the episodes are transcribed on the blog so you can read them at your leisure. For more information, check out soilandroots.org, and you can email us at fish@soilandroots.org, and we'll see you next time.